opportunity to say, hey, in a quiet environment, not necessarily in a business environment, what's happening in my neighborhood? What is my neighborhood? And then how and what things you need to know to make sure in terms of overall impact, you have an opportunity to have the tools that you need to be able to answer and ask questions, not only of your elected officials, but others in terms of developers who may come in and start the development process. That's one of the things that you're going to see now in Clarkston. We are perfect for the market from the perspective of developers are ready to come in and start developing in Clarkston because we're just 285. We're not the houses that are $500,000. So this is a wonderful city for if you wanted to start development in our community. The issue is, how do you balance that? And those are the questions we have to ask as a community, and especially our elected officials. I want to recognize Jamie for coming out, Jamie Carroll. Thank you for coming out. But are we going to be a suburban community? Are we going to be an urban community? And all of these things that you're going to hear about today really have impact on that in terms of how we zone our community. But as residents working with our elected officials, it is important that we have that dialogue to understand what the implications of all of those pieces are. It's not just a quick fix, and it has to be the overall strategy of how we're going to do economic development in our community. Zoning is a part of that strategy, and so as you're having those discussions and understanding of what we're doing, it's important that you understand that strategy is the overall mechanism for us to make that change. Elements of that strategy will include rezoning. That also includes economic development and other toolboxes that developers and other people can utilize. So that's why it's important for you to understand some of the language that is going to be used when you're engaging and working with developers. So with that in mind, we're very excited to have a guest speaker. Her name is Susan Garrett, but she's not too much of a guest speaker because she lives in Clarkston. So Susan currently holds the position of Deputy City Attorney for the Finance Practice Group of the City of Atlanta Law Department. The Finance Practice Group provides legal advice to all city departments in financial transactions, procurement, contracts, legislation, and land use matters. So we got somebody who knows what she's talking about, right? So, prior to that, she held the positions of Senior Assistant City Procurement, the Department of Information Technologies, the Department of Parks and Recreation, and numerous other city departments and agencies. She also represented the Departments of Planning and Community Development and Zoning and Land Matters and served as counsel to the City of Atlanta Board of Zoning Adjustment. Ms. Garrett joined the City of Atlanta Law Department in 2012 after 3 years as Assistant City Attorney and Acting City Attorney in East Point, Georgia. And then I found out she was one here in Clarkston.
She served us, yeah. She was our city attorney.
Prior to that, she worked in private practice and emphasized on zoning, land use, historical preservation, and civil litigation. She's a graduate of McGill University in Montreal and received her law degree from Emory University. She has taught legal research, writing, and appellate advocacy at both Emory and Georgia State University Law School, and currently teaches a graduate course in historical preservation law at Georgia State University Heritage Preservation Program. So please welcome Ms. Garrett.
Good morning, everyone. As you were told, I live in Clarkston. I have lived here for coming up on 20 years. I live in Clark Estates on Clydale Drive across the street from Susan Hood. And I live here because I want to, not because I can't afford to live someplace else, or not because of any other reason. So, but I'm here today just to give you a straight up legal background on how it is that cities and counties are authorized to impose zoning and other land use regulations. I'm not here to take a position about anything. And, you know, you can do that on your own after you get informed about whatever the current issues are. But I just want to make that clear. A lot of people, you know, you have your own feelings about how can they regulate my property. You know that there's sort of a political spectrum about that, property rights people who believe that there should be no regulation, and people at the other end who think it's important to have a lot of regulation. And what I'm here to talk about is what the Constitution and the Supreme Court say about the extent to which local governments can do that and what the limitations are. So this is a condensation of about 3 law school classes, and it's a condensation even further of the historic preservation course that I teach at Georgia State in 1 semester. You might find the material a little dense, and don't worry about that. There's not going to be a test. I just want you to take away from this some notion of how it is that we even have things like zoning laws. And unfortunately, I have to turn my back on you some to work the... So, and I apologize, the screen is small and the lights are bright, so you're not going to be able to see this too well. I think I have just found out why the picture is fading, the connection is loose, so I think I have engineered that. You're not going to be able to read it, but that's okay. It'll just keep me on track and I'll do the talking. Actually, if we just turn it up. So that previous screen was just a disclaimer saying that I'm not here to express opinions. I'm certainly not here to say anything on behalf of the city of Atlanta or Georgia State or any place else that I currently work or have worked. So I was telling Susan as I was getting ready to come over here this morning, I was freaking out because I couldn't find my bundle of sticks. Property rights are, lawyers refer to property rights as a bundle of sticks. How many of you own property? Okay, just about everyone. How many of you think you own your entire property? Okay, your property is a bundle of sticks, and these sticks represent your rights in property. So, most of us, we'll use me for an example. Let's say this is my property. Okay, I still owe, I had to borrow money to buy my property, and Delta Community Credit Union still holds a mortgage on my property. So, Delta Community Credit Union owns a bunch of my sticks. Now, DeKalb County provides water and sewer service, and some of that comes across my property. It comes across the right-of-way on the edge of my property. So DeKalb County owns a few of my sticks for that. I also have to pay property taxes to DeKalb County, so that's more of my sticks. I also pay more property taxes to the city of Clarkston. That's more of my sticks. Georgia Power has a couple of my sticks because they have easements to run power lines. Comcast, AT&T, and the city and the county, but mostly the city, also are authorized to impose regulations on how I use and how I develop my property. More of my sticks. These are my sticks. And the law says that's okay as long as all of these stick holders stay within the limits of their legal and constitutional authority.
Susan, I have a question about the last group of sticks. Clarkston has control over the front, right? But not your backyard.
I can't really answer specifically
Yeah.
about what Clarkston
Any
has or
city,
hasn't.
any
I
city owns the front.
Typically,
Yeah.
there is a portion of the right-of-way on the frontage of your
Yeah.
property that is subject to control by the
city,
utilities and the
yeah.
local governments. But I got so much to talk about today, I don't want to get sidetracked. So there's constitutional foundations for property ownership rights, and they're found in the Fifth Amendment, beginning with the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution, and the operative language, it's familiar to you, I'm sure. No person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation. So notice that it doesn't say, no person shall be deprived of property by the government ever, ever, ever. It just says that if you're going to be deprived of your property, you're entitled to due process of law. Or if they take it out and not take it, you're entitled to compensation. So the 14th Amendment, that applies, the Fifth Amendment applies to the federal government. The 14th Amendment makes it apply to the states, and the state of Georgia in turn has delegated that authority to the local governments. And it says essentially the same thing. No deprivation of property without due process of law, or in violation of equal protection of the laws. Thank you. So property rights, everything concerning regulation of property rights is a balancing test. That's why the law is depicted as the scales of justice, because it's weighing, on the one hand, the governmental power to both take property for a public purpose, to regulate property, to promote the public health, safety, welfare, against the property owner's rights to due process, equal protection, and compensation. What does that mean? The powers of eminent domain, which the state, local governments, certain utilities have, and certain other agencies have, is the power to actually take your property from you for a public purpose. So the government is allowed to take private property to devote it to a public purpose as long as it pays you for it. Thank you. Due process means that whenever the government is planning to do something to your property, either regulate it or take it, you're entitled to procedural due process, which means you get to be notified. That's why we post notices of rezonings, for instance, as well as an opportunity to be heard. So that means there's a public hearing, the property owner gets to say how they feel about it, the neighbors or other people, other citizens get to say how they feel about it. That's procedural due process. Adequate notice and an opportunity to be heard. Substantive due process is what protects you against unlawful taking or regulation of your property, meaning that the government goes too far beyond its authority. Thank you. So how does local government regulate property? Well, let's go down to the bottom of the list first. This is not a regulation, but something that most local governments do because it entitles them to benefits of certain funding and other opportunities from the state government, is they develop a comprehensive plan. And the comprehensive plan isn't exactly a law, but it is the local government's established policy document for how they want growth and development to proceed in the future. So the comprehensive plan is less specific than the zoning ordinance, but it lays out the basic plan that the consensus is we want to encourage this type of development in this area and this type of activity in another area. Turn that around since you're doing it now. In addition, we have the state law, the Georgia Zoning Procedures Law, that only applies to zoning. Oh, I'm sorry, would you go back? I didn't finish that slide. Let's get to the last one. So going back to the beginning, the actual regulations of property, the basic regulation that most people are familiar with is the zoning ordinance. What zoning does at its essence is regulate the use of property, how you can use your property. Now, tied to that will be development standards, like the zoning ordinance will say, in this part of the city, in this section of the city, we want to encourage single-family homes that have at least a half-acre lot. That's a traditional zoning classification. And so you're not allowed to have commercial enterprises, you're not allowed to have industrial uses, you can't build a hotel, you can't build an apartment building. That's the use aspect of the property. Now, the zoning ordinance will also set some standards about how big the structure can be, or how close it can go to the property line, or other features, but those are really development regulations. And there's typically a separate development code that regulates the standards by which property can be subdivided, and the development aspects of what type of buffers you need, what type of infrastructure you need, and how the lots can be divided, and what type of street access they need to have, and everything. That's the development code. And the building code is what it sounds like. It regulates the structural requirements. And all through the process, there's various permits and approvals that are required. We also have sign ordinances that regulate the size, placement, and appearance of signs. And I talked about the comprehensive plan already, so now we move on. So we're focusing on zoning today, which is the set of regulations that regulate the use of property. And Georgia has established a zoning procedures law that governs the process, the procedural part of how zonings and rezonings take place. So that applies to all local governments, and it's very serious not to follow the zoning procedures law. It will invalidate the decision. So the Georgia zoning procedures law specifies how you give notice, how much time the notice needs to be out, how it is placed, how it is advertised, and certain requirements for the enactment and application of any law that's a zoning decision. And it defines zoning decision as a governmental action affecting the use or development of property according to districts. So not every decision that a local government makes concerning land is a zoning decision. I just threw this slide in, and this presentation is sort of a composite of different presentations that I have, that in addition to the zoning procedures law that governs how much notice and what kind of public hearing is held and everything like that, every local government gathering may be subject to the Georgia Open Meetings Law, which requires that meetings be open to the public. I didn't edit this because this is coming from a preservation petition, but it applies whenever a quorum of the government gathers to conduct official business, even if it's in the coffee house across the street. And it requires 24 hours posted notice of a meeting, so that would be in addition to any requirement under the zoning law. And again, a violation of the open meetings law invalidates the action taken. So for instance, one time, some of my historic preservation students went to observe the DeKalb County Historic Preservation Commission, and they inadvertently had locked the door to the building, and my students were standing outside, unable to get in, along with one of the property owners whose application for a certificate of appropriateness was coming up that night. So they weren't able to take action on that. They had to repeat it the next time because it was a violation of the open meetings law. Next. So back to property regulation. The basic principle is that the government may subject property to reasonable regulation to promote the public health, safety, and welfare. And that's grounded in the 5th and 14th Amendments to the Constitutions. But if a regulation goes too far, it will become a regulatory taking. So that means, we talked briefly about eminent domain. If you live on a state highway and GDOT decides that they need to widen your highway, you'll get a certified letter from GDOT saying, we need 10 feet of your frontage and here's what we're gonna pay you for it. That's eminent domain, that is a taking, but it's pursuant to the powers of eminent domain. They're taking the property away from you, they're paying you for it. By the same token, you can regulate property, sink people's property so much that they can't really use it anymore, then it's a regulatory taking. But the limits on that are much different from what a lot of people think they are. One of the landmark Supreme Court cases concerning zoning was Euclid versus Ambler Realty from 1926. And this was really when cities were first starting to zone their property. Before zoning, you could have a nice home and there was no restriction on what somebody could do next door to you. So that's one of the things that we have to think about when we think about, well, I want to be able to do whatever I want with my property. That sounds great when you're thinking about your property, but then when your neighbor says the same thing and starts getting the chickens and goats and smokehouse, starts burning things in the backyard, or has a slaughterhouse back there, you develop a different attitude about that. So you may have heard of Euclidean zoning. It comes from this 1926 case. The city of Euclid, which is in Ohio, enacted its zoning code in 1922, and it divided it into 6 districts. And this detail is not important, except that it shows you the traditional type of use zoning that has become known as Euclidean zoning. And so the least intensive form of zoning is considered single-family detached homes. And then it's cumulative, so that the next category allows duplex units, but you can still have a single family if you want. The next category allows apartments, but you can have a duplex or a single family as you want. And it goes on down to the most intense use, which is industrial, with commercial in the middle. So what happened in this case was this Ambler Realty Company had bought in 1911 68 acres of land, which was before the zoning ordinance existed. And they had plans to, it was near the railroad, and they had plans to develop it for industrial use. But the zoning, before they did anything about developing it, the zoning code was passed, and as a result, the way their property was zoned, they could only develop 60% of it for industrial development, which is usually the most profitable form of development. And they would have to put apartments and duplexes on the other 26 acres. And so they sued, next slide, the city of Euclid. And the Ambler Realty Company was claiming that this zoning was depriving them of their property because they weren't able to get the maximum profit that they were expecting out of their property. And the city said, no, we need to regulate the property for the public health, safety, and welfare because we can't have this entire area be industrial with children living across the street. We've got to keep the industrial property over by the railroad tracks and then step it down to the single-family residential area to protect the public. And they said this is a reasonable exercise of our police powers under the Constitution. And it went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court sided with the city and said that a zoning ordinance is a legitimate exercise of the city's police powers unless it goes so far that they can't use the property anymore. So that's a really rapid version of what is really a complex area of the law, which most lawyers even don't understand unless they're specialists. And so the takeaway is that zoning is legitimate. The Supreme Court, even a very conservative Supreme Court, is not going to say that a local government can't zone property. It can restrict the use of property, but it's supposed to do so, number one, pursuant to a comprehensive planning document that reflects the consensus of the residents and the government officials about what's the future view, what do we want to encourage, what do we want the city to look like 10, 20 years from now. And the processes have to be followed so that everybody gets adequate notice, everybody gets a chance to be heard on it. And finally, you can't regulate property to such a great extent that it cannot be used. And the way to test that is, would anybody buy it for any reason? So if you've got, for example, a piece of land that is so small, nothing can lawfully be built on it, that's an unusable piece, essentially an unusable piece of property. So that's it in a nutshell. I'll take general questions. I don't know how much time we have. I don't want to go too long, but I don't want to give opinions about specific ordinances and things that I haven't read. Yes, ma'am.
So the Euclidean zoning pattern that we all kind of understand is the reason that when people fuss about mixed use, you can't put a attorney sign on your house if you live in a neighborhood and you want to have an office in your house.
Mm-hmm. That's a great question.
Is that
Euclidean zoning is the traditional form of zoning. The more current thinking is moving away from Euclidean
That's what I
zoning.
thought.
And to a large degree, the last round of the zoning rewrite in Clarkston incorporated more the concept of having mixed uses in certain districts, because I think during the maybe 90s and early 2000s, maybe earlier than that, people started to question the suburban, get in your car to drive everywhere to work and to the store mentality. And people were starting to think, no, it would be nice to be able to live and work and play in the same area, to be able to walk places, to have more public transportation. And it's also driven sometimes by the demand for land, that people just have to live more densely because there's not enough land. So that's a great question, because there is a move away from that traditional Euclidean zoning, which is residential here, multifamily here, commercial here, and industrial over there. Yes?
Where do non-conforming uses and pre-existing conditions, non-conforming use
Illegal
fit
non-conforming.
into the whole
Okay.
matrix of zoning?
Illegal non-conforming use is, let's say that you have an apartment. I'll give you an example from East Point. When I worked in East Point, East Point had developed as a blue-collar town with a lot of duplexes, a lot of cute little craftsman-like houses, but they were built as duplexes. And at one point, the city said, no, we want single-family houses everywhere, and they rezoned most of their residential area for single-family. But these duplexes still existed. So if, at the time the new zoning was enacted, you had a house that was built as a duplex, being used as a duplex, when they passed the law that made your district a single-family district, it didn't mean that you were allowed to continue the use as a duplex as long as you did so continuously. If you stopped using it as a duplex, and this happened actually in East Point because due to the real estate downturn, a lot of houses lay vacant for more than a year. If they were not used as duplexes for that time period, when somebody bought the house and reoccupied it, they had to conform to the zoning, because the legal non-conforming use had stopped while the property, it was abandoned essentially while the property lay empty. So the enactment of a new zoning and most other land use regulations will not affect you not affect your current status as long as you continue it. But as soon as you decide to change, or as soon as you abandon that use, it's going to have to come up to conformity with the new code. Yes?
So the phrase grandfathered in
That's what that refers to.
Oh,
That's how people call it. That's the common way that people refer to illegal non-conforming use.
So if the duplex was actually owned on both sides, and it was vacant for a year, it had to be reconverted it back to a single family?
These duplexes were unitary ownership, but they were rented out as duplexes, so it wasn't divided ownership.
Would
It wasn't
that
a type
make a
of
difference
duplex.
if they had been owned on both sides? I'm curious about that. Because that sounds unfair, kind of, on the face of it.
Yeah, that would have been different, because you would have had a different type of ownership.
Okay.
But, so if you have, a good example is the little store that's over on McClendon. Yeah, that little store that's in the middle of a residential neighborhood on McClendon. It's been there forever. I think they've had some fights about whether the legal non-conforming use was abandoned or not, but it's there in that sort of odd place because it's a legal non-conforming use. Okay, so I think it's time to move on to our next presentation, and you all know Susan Hood, who is my neighbor, across the street neighbor. Susan has a master's in urban studies, and she has worked in local government for 20 years, including as a land use planner for the city of Atlanta before my time in the city, unfortunately. She specialized in zoning there. She has experience in governmental budgeting, financial analysis, and process improvement. Later, she was hired to direct a study at the zoo, which at that time, some of you may recall, was a substandard facility owned and operated by the city. As a result, the zoo was restructured as a nonprofit organization. As the first assistant director of Zoo Atlanta, Susan was a member of the senior leadership team that transformed the zoo into the highly acclaimed institution it is today. Susan retired from DeKalb County 4 years ago after having served as head of the Park, Bond, and Green Space Office, where she oversaw a budget of $142 million and expanded the county's park and green space inventory by 1,100 acres. Susan.
Before I begin, we may just have to take a little bit of a break. It's important that everybody have these handouts because we first want to identify what your property is zoned, because you won't know what is happening to your property if you don't know what it is zoned. So anyone who did not get one of these, please sign in. Dean, where did Dean get off to? Dean will help you locate your property on the zoning map. Anybody else need the information?
They are. 7 chickens wandering in for now, but for 8 months and I didn't lose a single one. And next door, she lost all of them. And she lost all of them. Heading up, it's out.
I don't mind going. Everyone else is.
I know, I'm driving you crazy, Dean, I'm sorry. I'm sorry? I guess I'm in art.
There's just the one down there.
So we want to, recognize the council members that walked in. So we have Councilman Yasu came in, everybody.
Right.
And we have Councilwoman Simone, she walked in too. So we want to make sure we recognize our elected officials.
Where are you over there, like where the Chester lives?
So does everyone have copies of the information? Number one. Everybody has copies. No, raise your hand. And we'll make sure we have it.
Go over there, the house is a little.
Yeah, I'm recording it, yeah. It'll probably be on next door. All right? Because I usually put it on next door.
So if everybody's ready, we'll start up again. You don't mind, so take a seat.
I'll put it under Clarkston zoning meeting. That's what I'll put it on. All right? Okay.
So you're in the ditch, you're in the ditch.
All right, let's start with going through the zoning ordinance. The first major changes that are taking place in the zoning ordinance, and this is being proposed by City Council, has to do with zoning procedures. And there are a number of improvements in these procedures that make it much easier for neighbors to know what is happening with changes for rezonings and variances. Shawana Kawhi, who is head of planning and development for the city of Clarkston, she and I both contributed a number of items to these procedures, so that citizens, number one, if a rezoning is taking place near your house, you will get a letter in the mail telling you about that. Yes.
Then you'll be sad a little.
Well, just think our recent unpleasantness with the church. If that had been in place, we would have been so much better off. People would have known earlier, that sort of thing. Also, more studies will be able to be required from a developer if planning and zoning requires them, traffic studies and things like that, which they don't now have the authority to require. That's more good information for making sure we have the development. Conditional use permits now go to planning and zoning, they did not before. A developer who is developing something over a certain size will be required to have a public meeting before moving forward through the process. So that also is very good news for the community to be able to learn sooner and more information about what's happening with zonings. There was one thing, though, that I stumbled upon, really. I was surprised to find it, that is an interesting change in the procedures. Typically, if you come in and you want to rezone your property, or you want to make a large development, if your application goes through the process and city council votes it down, in the past, you had to wait 12 months before reapplying. That's pretty much standard in all zoning ordinances. Ours is a proposed change to 2 months.
What?
So you leave a council meeting where you have spent a lot of time expressing your views against something. Before you're to the parking lot, the applicant is redating all of the documents and walking over to City Hall and putting them back in.
Yeah.
So
Why not a quarter? Why did they pick 2 months rather than a quarter?
it should be 12 months.
It should
Some
definitely-
places, Decatur,
Definitely.
2 years.
12 months, it should be.
But then what they've got now is not appealing to Decatur. So I mean, it seems like a quarter. I'm worried about places that get rezoned and then they get turned down and then it just sits there like a big pile of crap for years and years and years. A great example on North Avenue where the Fuji school was supposedly going to go in. I don't like waiting. So
2 months, I
2
will
months
leave
is
that
not
to you.
long enough, but a quarter might be long enough.
There are a number of changes in the definitions that change in the waiting time is on page 9 if anybody's interested in that. There's some changes in the definitions, adding family child care learning home, adding early learning programs, and child care learning center. That is not my field. I don't really understand the distinctions between them. It does say that a family child care learning home is a business in a private residence or apartment where 3 to 6 children can be cared for less than 24 hours a day. And I think that would, as a business, it would be required to have a business license.
Yes.
But it would not require any approval from the city. It is by right, if you wanted to keep children in your home, up to 6 of them for less than 24 hours a day.
It might require fire coding, we're still debating.
Right, but not from the standpoint of a conditional use permit or something like that, it does not require that. So yes,
The
it
family
would require
daycare
the
home has
state.
never had any health or fire, and the new fire marshal, who's a whack job in DeKalb, he wants to fire code everything. So that may happen, and that would negate it, because fire coding is so expensive if you already do a family daycare. Not gonna be able to run. Now, what about group home, the next size up? Is that addressed, which is
I'm not familiar
under
with
12
that. I
kids?
didn't see any changes in there,
Yeah, I
but
didn't
you
either.
may want to look at that. There are some changes in page 24, section 605, home occupations. Home occupations can now be 1 resident and 2 employees. Before it was 2 residents. So that's a change you would want to be aware of. Now, I want to get into the major changes are in the major zoning districts. Does everybody know what their property is zoned? All right, I'm going to talk about neighborhood residential 1, which is low density residential. That's anything in light yellow on this map. That's Friendship Forest. So all of this down to here, and up over there. The proposal for low density neighborhood single family is to reduce the minimum lot size by 50%. So if you have this chart, you will see this is the current size, and these are to scale, of a low-density, single-family. Our minimum lot size in Clarkston for that is 10,000 square feet, which is a little bit under 1/4 of an acre. What you're seeing here with the dashed line is what's called the buildable area. That's where all the setbacks, when you go to develop a property, the code tells you how much you have to have of setback in your front yard and your side yards and your rear yards. And then you can put your house anywhere within that buildable area. Our minimum house size in low density residential is 1,000 square feet. On average, the single family house size in Clarkston is 1,400 to 1,500 square feet. Brian Medford's wife has done some excellent research on that, about house sizes in Clarkston. Here's the proposed change. The lot size would be reduced by 50%. The setbacks would be reduced. Minimum house size would be 700 square feet. Just for reference, the average size of a 1-bedroom apartment in the city of Atlanta, in the area, 775 square feet.
Does that mean that, I'm trying to figure out how this plays out in the tax world. So if we, those of us in NR1, don't do anything, will our taxes be higher because our lot size is now bigger?
No. No, your tax should not change. Let me back up and say, that's not my field. I would not expect the taxes to change. What this does mean is if your neighbor has a double lot,
Right.
and their house is not in the very center of it, maybe their house is off to the side, as long as they can meet these setback requirements where their existing house is, they can cut the lot in half,
Put another house there.
sell it, and
Yes.
a 700 square foot house can be built on it.
So, you said the dotted line was buildable?
Dotted line is buildable area. So you've got your
So it
lot,
doesn't have to be 700 square feet, it can be.
and then you've got your buildable area that just says, here's your lot. You have to set, you can't build closer to the street than 30 feet. You can't have it closer to the back than 25 feet, etc. So within that dashed line, which is called the buildable area, you can put your house wherever you want to. You couldn't put your house right here, because you have to put it within the buildable area. Yes?
Now, there used to be a size restriction for the large end of it, and you couldn't build over 50% of your lot in buildable space. Has that changed?
Yes.
It'll be triple.
There is a maximum size, and it has to do with the amount of lot you can cover. In this area, in this district, I will have to look it up. Let's see what page that is. I think that is 4,
It's currently 0.4.
29.
Currently
It's
0.4 for
0.9.
NR1.
Okay. Now, what is the other change that is happening?
How did you know that it was 29? Are you using an index?
No, it's on your handout. If you look on the green, right below, on your green sheet, right below where you filled out what your property is zoned,
Oh, okay.
there are the page references to that section.
So that's how you do it, okay.
Yes. And I have it written here. Yes. The lot size, building coverage is Jamie said,
Currently 0.4 for FAR, it'll be 0.5 into the change.
this is building coverage is 50%. Now, the coverage of the lot at 50% is an easier concept. In other words, here's your buildable area. You couldn't do more than 50% of your entire lot. So you can tell that this buildable area is bigger than 50% of the entire lot. So you couldn't build something that was that big.
Oh, so it's not really the buildable area.
It's the buildable, it's where your lot can be, where your house can be
You can
placed.
put your house anywhere within that.
You can put your house anywhere
Build a
in
house,
that.
build a whole,
Okay, I get it now. I didn't get that before now.
Now, what the zoning code is doing, changes, is they are eliminating the reference to percent of lot coverage and going strictly according to floor area ratio. So I will pass this around, and this is a ratio of the size of the building to the lot. It's rather complicated. It's rarely used as the basis for how we calculate coverage of lot in residential areas because it's so confusing. It's much easier to say to the public or a developer, okay, don't cover more than 50% of your lot. Floor area ratio changes based on the footprint of the building and the height of the building.
Tricky.
It's very tricky.
So in that equation, basically, you could take any of these houses here that are on large lots and build a much larger structure, like a new mansion.
Yes. Yes. Yes, you could. And that's, not only can you build something that's 700 square feet, but you can cover more of the lot. So how much more you would have to get out your calculator and figure out the floor area ratio, what's your footprint going to be, how many stories is it going to be, etc. Let me talk a little bit about single-family low density. That's your basic neighborhood. That is what much of Clarkston is developed as. It's the standard neighborhood development. It's not, some people say single-family low density is exclusionary. In fact, towns have been sued for that.
Yeah.
Because they'll say, oh, the minimum lot size in our town is 3 acres, and your house size has to be at least such and such. Well, what are you doing? You are regulating out anybody who can't afford that.
Teachers and firefighters and police
So-
officers, yeah.
A 1/4 acre lot, which is what we have here, in some districts might even be considered medium density. It is very typical in cities to have a minimum lot size of 1/2 acre, even an acre. So if we have neighborhoods based on a reasonable size of a lot at 10,000 square feet, and we say that we are going to reduce it by 50%, you have eliminated low-density single-family. This is medium-density single-family. Okay? Yes?
My lot size is 1/2 acre. How much is the house beside me, the story house? It would be an acre.
I'm sorry, what?
The story house next door to me, like it's double, that would be an acre lot.
Mhm.
And what about the summer house, it would be?
I
2
think it
acres,
might be a little
half.
less than an acre. If you're asking how many houses how many 700 square foot houses could
Well,
be
they
put
look
there?
like single, double, triple, size-wise.
I mean, you could get a lot of houses.
Yeah.
Think about the minimum frontage now is,
So on the Sanger house lot, they could easily put 4 houses
most likely.
and 2 in the other.
See, right now, our minimum frontage is 75 feet. It will go down to 50 feet.
Where is it? Oh,
Now, yes,
So you're saying that anyone with a house on a lot could subdivide the lot if it meets these requirements, these minimum requirements? But it would basically be luck of the draw as to how their current house and lot is laid out, as to whether they would be able to subdivide.
correct.
That's true. So it could be, you could end up with a street where half the lots get subdivided and the other half are not able to be subdivided. So it's going to look kind of mix and match, right?
Exactly. Not only that, and I'll talk about that, I'll go ahead and talk about that now. Clarkston's housing inventory is a little old and not as well maintained as we might want it to be.
That was so nicely
Very
said.
timely.
Are you running for mayor? I recognize that kind of talk.
So, what that could lead to, and has led to in other situations, is for a developer to come in and buy houses at a very low price, 2, 3, 4, demolish them, and do this.
Right.
So you could, the effect on the neighborhoods is really potentially significant. If you think of areas where the upkeep is not as great as it could be, somebody makes you a good offer, makes your neighbor a good offer, you have changed the tenor, the concept, the character of the neighborhood irreparably. And that's a concern. Yes?
And I'll say this because when I was on council, one of the things that we said we would continue to do is do an impact analysis study so that we could see what financially, in terms of safety, public safety, is that going to be something that's going to be brought up? Because I think that would help the community to be able to understand long-term when all of these changes, you can't just say, we're going to put all these houses. What, from an impact to the overall community, that needs to be something for the community to see in terms of the city going back to do a diligence.
Right. And that, I think you've hit on an important point. It is very important that a strategy with appropriate outcomes that the community buys into and has an opportunity to sit at the table and say, well, this might work here, but we want to put restrictions where it couldn't do this or couldn't do that. This is a one-size-fits-all approach to low density. And as I say, it eliminates low-density single-family housing in this city. I have never heard of that in a city like Clarkston or a smaller city where you have this sort of, the strength of Clarkston, as somebody said when talking about this. The strength of Clarkston is in its neighborhoods. It's not in its commercial.
No.
The commercial needs help, and there are some recommendations in here that will help that. But there's nothing wrong with this.
Not a thing.
There is absolutely, in my opinion, now I'm going to try to let y'all know when I'm giving an opinion. And also that opinion is based on my professional experience. There is just nothing wrong with low-density, single-family houses.
Susan, I don't know how big my house is, it's probably 1,000, I don't know, I'm not a square foot girl. But my house was built in 1924, and it's 2-bedroom, 1-bath bungalow. It does have a sun porch on the back, but it's just, the washer and dryer and various things are out there. But it's got 2 teeny tiny closets, and I'm just overwhelmed with lack of, storage space. And if you had a house that you said is the size of a 1-bedroom apartment in Atlanta, you couldn't have, pets or anywhere to put anything. I mean, you'd be having stuff, if you're like me, you'd have stuff stacked in boxes to the ceiling.
Out in the yard.
That's ridiculous.
Watch this old house. They got a good thing for storage.
Now, Commissioner Carroll, who is here, has been the person who is working with this primarily. And he handed out some pictures, and so I'm going to use them here. This is an aerial of low-density, single-family. I think it's over in my neighborhood. It's off of Norman and, yes, Cranford.
Okay.
So and I'll pass this around to you. That is an aerial. Okay? Notice the trees? Can you see the houses?
Past Belglade going on in town, near Bunkie.
This was the handout that showed the results of these changes in low-density single-family. This is down on Marketplace, in the Marketplace. This is what the vision of this zoning change sees for low-density single-family. You see low-density single-family? Do you see many trees? You see primarily rooftops and pavement.
All developers are doing that now. No, I've been watching development years in Atlanta. No matter how much space they have, they kill all the trees and then put back those saplings. It's cheaper. So it's not just,
No,
I
I'm not
caution
talking
against saying
about,
no trees, but I'd say that development in general nowadays, they kill all the trees and then they
Exactly.
put back little saplings or donate to the tree bank.
right. But what this shows you is, now this might be the and this is in Clarkston in an area that's already currently appropriately zoned.
Yeah, I was gonna say.
And
You
so
gotta-
if this is what you like, great, you have options. But if the lot sizes are cut in half and the house sizes are reduced and the setbacks are eliminated, and if this is the goal for what we want as a neighborhood in Clarkston, what you have done instead of increasing options for housing is you have just chopped off one of the biggest and the one that is the heart of a city. So let me pass this around to you.
Susan, you have been, I believe, addressing primarily NR1 and NR2. Do you
No, I'm going
address,
to get into NR2.
do you address NR3, which is all the orange?
I know,
and
I'm
where I
going
live?
through it right now. I'll get there. All right, so,
There used to be an ordinance where if you wanted to cut down a tree on your property, you had to get a permit.
they still have it. Okay, questions about NR1?
You mentioned the lot sizes in Clarkston, and R1 is good. And the fact that some people may see that as, excessive lot size. I don't think of Clarkston as being, elitist. We're not like Sandy Springs or anything. But I'm curious, since you're familiar with the metropolitan area, where does Clarkston fall in land value, say, average land value? Are we on the higher end of the spectrum or somewhere else?
Are you kidding? That was very funny.
There is a big move in the city, and I support it, to solve issues of affordability. And much of the, Jamie, correct me if I'm wrong here, but much of the purpose for these changes is so that housing will be affordable. We have either the lowest or among the lowest housing values in the metro area now. Now what, there are other, so that helps us from the standpoint of affordability. There's still people who can't afford it. But there are other ways, there are other tools to help people with it. Yes?
So I think, and that's one of the things we wanted to make sure we cleared up today, is that there's a big difference between affordable housing and access to housing. And so sometimes when you're hearing that, it gets tangled in terms of the language and the definition. So one of the things that we don't have in terms of our housing stock in Clarkston is access to more housing, which is totally different than affordable housing. And so that is why we're even here today, to make sure when you hear people talking about that you're clear on what those definitions are.
Define them, because I don't know. Tell me.
That's an issue. You need to, the city needs to decide, and they have an affordable housing committee that's working, and I've read a lot of their material. And none of it doesn't say cut lot sizes in half to achieve affordable housing. It talks about using other tools, like a land trust, etc. But you need to, in my opinion, define affordable housing for your own community. Because affordability in downtown Atlanta or out in Alpharetta or anywhere, Tucker, Stone Mountain, it can differ. And we have a unique community here, as you know. So I think a community conversation about what do we mean by affordable housing. And there are statistics that are typically used that set in tiers levels of income that are below the mean income in a community. So you can be at the lowest tier, and so you've got the least, you're much lower than the mean income, and it goes up.
So are we on the lowest mean income? Because I think is it at 38? Is it 38?
Our income is very low in Clarkston. We have another purpose for these zoning changes, and if I say it wrong, tell me, but is to encourage development. A report was done by a gentleman who, from an institute, it was a free report. He determined that the reason the city of Clarkston has not been growing, and we have not, despite the fact that we're right next to 285, and despite the fact that after the recession other communities have been growing, the determination was that it was because our zoning regulations are too restrictive. Our zoning regulations, I have not done an exhaustive analysis of this, but based on my professional experience, Clarkston zoning regulations are typical of cities in this area. Yeah. There's nothing overly restrictive about Clarkston zoning regulations.
Susan, so
in my humble opinion.
Define accessibility. Is accessibility meaning like handicap accessibility?
No, I mean more
Financing.
having access to, for example, more houses in a community. So that's what, when we're talking about.
I'm still not hearing that. What
So
do you mean by having access?
for example, affordable housing. When you think about a lot of times with affordable housing, that means that you can't necessarily afford the house. And so there are government opportunities in terms of financing, funding,
Okay.
Section 8, those types of things.
Okay.
Or, for example, with the city has that funding that they're going to have. So if someone is unable to pay the down payment for a house, they're unable to, because that's a lot of times why people can't move into a house, is that they're unable to pay the closing costs, the down payment on a house, those types of things. So with that fund, you're allowing people to be able to afford to live in a home.
Okay, I hear that.
Right.
Now, accessibility, what is that?
Accessibility is, for example, when you're unable, because of how we particularly have zoned, to increase the number of houses in that particular zoning area. So you can change the zoning.
I don't know what you mean by accessibility either.
Okay. So, but having access to housing. So again, what I'm trying to make sure is that we from a city have, as Susan said, the lowest when you think about costs for a house. We're not going less than a mile away when you get to Scottsdale and you're seeing houses $300,000, $400,000, $500,000.
That's right.
So cost-wise, our costs are low. But when you look in terms of the stock of houses that are available for people to transition from an apartment into a house, we don't have that stock available for people to be able to do that. And so sometimes when you do that, you try to figure out how can we reduce the number of lot sizes so that we can increase the amount of houses available to people. But that doesn't necessarily mean that everywhere needs to be like that. You can have it where you have particular zone areas available for people to make sure that we have more access to homes.
Okay, well, here's my question on that then. The lot size isn't, here's my experience. When I bought my house, I was super poor. I had 2 kids in college. I'm a teacher, I make nothing. So I went to Wells Fargo, well, in those days, Wachovia, who I loved so much better. And Wachovia gave me a neighborhood, a new FHA program called Neighborhood Loans. And what I had to do, which was hard, was go to all my neighbors up Bell Avenue and ask them how much they thought their home was worth. So they all lied, of course, they thought it was worth millions and millions. But then the bank came back and examined the neighborhood and said, oh yeah, this is a poor neighborhood. And they gave me a great loan. I mean, I got an FHA loan when nobody else was getting them, and I didn't put but maybe $1,000 down initially. But what I'm thinking about in terms of what I saw, and when I was looking in this report, I thought, how am I going to house my kids? As I looked at the tiny house movement, and the shockaroo there is that those aren't that much cheaper. Some of those tiny houses are 80 to 120,000, and you're sitting on a driveway. You don't even have a lot of grass or anything. So the tiny house movement isn't actually affordable or accessible as far as I'm concerned. However, this is what I'm not understanding still. If the lot size is smaller, that's not going to create affordability, because we saw that with the tiny house movement. A huge disappointment to me, not at all what I anticipated. Because I came from co-housing and we really examined the tiny house.
So that's another
So lot size
aspect,
isn't related
is that
to money.
affordable housing can be achieved with various tools. We now have an affordable housing trust fund. There's other tools that you can use. A land trust where you acquire property, hold it, wait for somebody to come, and you can arrange for them to acquire the house in certain terms if they redevelop it, that sort of thing. But there are a lot of possibilities. But again, just coming in and saying lot size half, 700 square foot houses, here comes affordable housing.
I would add that the city of Atlanta is having a big struggle with this now, that the state law does not allow governments to restrict what owners and developers charge for houses unless they are receiving governmental benefits in order to do their development. So for example, in the Beltline area, Atlanta has an inclusionary zoning ordinance that requires that new development in the Beltline include a certain percentage of apartments that are, or units that are available to people with, say, 60% of the median income. And first of all, the developers are screaming about it because it affects their financing for their development. So, but because they're in the Beltline, they're getting certain benefits from being in that overlay district. We're even able to have the ordinance, but you can't just, in Georgia, pass an inclusionary zoning ordinance. I think I said exclusionary before I meant inclusionary. An inclusionary zoning ordinance over the whole city, nor can you impose rent control, nor can you tell developers that, you know, you cannot charge more than X, or you have to set aside a certain amount of units that are going to be low priced, unless you're giving them some kind of incentives or tax breaks or something,
A bonus or something. Let's move on to NR2. Down in this area.
Is NR2 yellow, the light?
It's the darker yellow. Right down here at the end of Market. Here on your sheet, to scale. The lot size now, $7,500 square feet. Cut it in half, 3,700 square feet. Minimum house size now, 900 square feet. 700 square feet for the small house.
They're two-story?
It doesn't, you can have stores, yes, 2 stores. So,
Maximum building height is 50 feet now, and one's 25, so you're twice as high.
so the heights are being increased as well. And
Yes.
this is particularly important in another district. So, once again,
Not quite right.
15 feet.
we have a situation where, and let me point out also, this is the current lot size for NR2. This is the proposed lot size for NR1. Proposed lot size for NR1 is smaller than the current lot size for NR2. That's why I am saying it is eliminating single-family zoning. NR3. Anybody here in NR3? NR3 is high residential. It's orange.
So it's townhouses?
Here, 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 and here.
That's apartments.
All of that is NR3. In the past, or let's say currently, it is single-family detached, multifamily, duplexes, triplexes, townhouses, etc. The proposed change will include commercial. There's a list, if you go to page 31, if you live in that district, there will be a list of the commercial uses that will be permitted in that district. So instead of Clarkston having 3 residential districts, we now have 2 residential districts, 2 medium residential districts. This is medium, this is maybe even high density. All of the orange will be residential and commercial. these two districts right here, single-family residential and medium residential, will be the only place in Clarkston that does not permit commercial development. The rest of the city will permit commercial development at different levels.
Why is that excluded?
This is the single family. And that, you see, everything else in our city, this is industrial. Everything else in our city will have either exclusively commercial or, well, actually, there may not even be any exclusively commercial.
But none of this has to be.
Let's get to the end of this.
None of this has to be.
Let's get to the
Right.
end of all of the changes that
That's
are
a question.
proposed, and then we will talk about the process. Let me also mention that there are some significant changes in the townhouse. Oh, go ahead.
I have a question about the residential/commercial. As an artist, I'm aware that it's, a lot of people are looking for a place that they can both live and work. There's a huge demand for that. People want to have a home business and they can't do their business in their home because it doesn't meet the zoning, and people that can't live where they have to work. So I would think that there's a demand for something like that, and if it's, you know, well regulated, like militias, it could be a very a feather in our cap if we provided something like that.
And we have that in our current zoning. In our current zoning, anything in pink, red, brown, and purple accommodates that.
I could be wrong, but I've heard stories of people who said, yeah, I tried to do that, but they wouldn't let me, or, but I don't see much of it happen.
And I do agree that the whole idea of combining residential and commercial has benefits. But I think to take a whole large zoning district
Right.
without discerning what areas within that might be more appropriate, and just say, okay, one size fits all. So that, to me, is a theme throughout this. But you're exactly right, and the place for that is close to the town center where you have transportation nodes and people can walk to downtown and that sort of thing. It makes perfect sense, and it is an important change in the way people are living their lives.
What's in that orange area, the big orange area now?
This is single family and apartments and duplexes. This is off of Jolly Avenue, Pecan, Mel. There's some of this is single family residential right through here.
And that's NR2?
This is three. This is where the commercial will be permitted.
So you could have a townhouse with a coffee shop on the bottom floor and a dry cleaner like they do all over Atlanta.
Exactly.
And that would serve the community in a sense, because there's none of that stuff now.
Well, but we do have zoning for that now.
Like they did in Brookhaven.
We do have zoning for that now, and I will get to those changes in a minute. We do have zoning for that.
Oh, I
For
thought
that
we did.
now. No, we do have it. Neighborhood commercial, pink, all of this. Neighborhood commercial too, all of that, here. We already have that zoning, but that's being changed. Yes, ma'am.
Okay, like speaking of that area that you're seeing right there, those are all single-family homes and a very few of multifamily homes.
There are some apartments in there.
Yeah, but it primarily, that entire area are the residents of Clarkston. And I'm going to say this to you. When you drive into Clarkston and you're looking to buy a house, and you drive down a neighborhood, what is attractive to you about that neighborhood? We have places all over Clarkston where they did exactly what they're talking about now. They allowed a strip mall, essentially, commercial business, to build inside of a residential area. And then another one would be next to it, and another one would be next to it. We've got, drive around, you'll see them 20 years later, it does not value that neighborhood. Maybe in the first 5 or 6 years, sure, somebody wants to build a condo complex with the dry cleaners and that kind of stuff. I hear the idea, but if you look at that map, there are very few places here where we actually have residential neighborhoods. We're talking about bringing in much more traffic, lots more people in a residential area where we already have problems with people being able to use the street and walk their dogs.
Exactly.
I'm really wondering, even the percentage of multifamily versus single-family housing that we have in Clarkston, why on earth are we trying to break up established neighborhoods
Thank you.
to create something that, I mean, we can't do anything about what they did 25 years ago, but that's part of what we're dealing with now. When you drive around Clarkston and these crappy places, this is what they did 25 years ago. They said, sure, you could put some commercial right there. We need commercial buildings. Sure, you could put a tire shop there or a car wash. But once you rate that commercial, we don't have that much control over what they want to put in there. And the other thing that I've just got to say, the city has been woefully neglectful in grandfathering in commercial buildings and usage that isn't appropriate because it's already been built. For example, several Magic Markets over there, they only had the right to build one gas station and a single other storefront with it, but they built 2. Well, they didn't make it tear them down. You know, when they built the houses on Jolly Avenue, where they built houses that were 3 times as big as the ones right next to them. Those were supposed to be finished to a certain spec, but they didn't get finished to a certain spec, but they still got approved. And we're seeing the results of that all over. So to me, I don't know why basically kind of breaking up and gutting our neighborhoods, that's the viability of Clarkston. The viability of when people come here and they are attracted to living here, it is not our commercial zones. It is our residential zones. It is our parks. It is the people in the community here. If we continue to act as though the people who live here and their houses and environments aren't important, exactly where's the benefit to that? That's not going to help us increase more good investors. Because they look for things like stable neighborhoods. And we can't say, oh yeah, I'd love to have a coffee shop on the end of a, like they have in Brookhaven. You know, when they did all that kind of stuff, like Duluth and some of those towns, they had a comprehensive city plan with investors. They didn't do this. Okay, they did not piecemeal it. They had a comprehensive city plan knowing exactly what buildings they were going to demolish and change. They had investors already set up to do the work in a certain spec. And I'm all for that. We've got tons of empty space. And tons of people who'd love to make commercial business here. I'm a business person, so I'm all for that. But, because we need more jobs. But just calling something commercial is not really doing that. And it doesn't make fiscal sense for Clarkston either, because it just means we have to pay more to police those areas and the infrastructure and all the kind of stuff that goes along with that.
Let me point out that maybe there are parts here that could and should and it would be beneficial to the city to allow some of that commercial. But I think that's a separate discussion around a strategy. And so, again, the one size fits all. And what we need is the strategic approach to, as Beverly said, and as you said, where are there within our city areas that we as a community could say, this might work, this is a good idea here, we could have a commercial there, but not every single piece of property in the whole area. So I bring that up, again, as I say, that's the thing. Let me just read one
You got
statement.
a question over there?
Oh, yes, Dean.
Yeah, on that note, going back 25 years ago, when you look at Church Street, you see townhouses, you see a car wash, those were all individual single-family homes at one time.
Every one of them, yeah.
And so what this zoning would do would be to allow that sort of infill, commercial development, and similar to when Susan Garrett mentioned the little store over here on McClendon. This is allowing some commercial into some areas that may not be appropriate. The businesses would eventually fail because those type of businesses don't really survive in this environment where you've got mobility and get to the publics up the street. But yeah, this is going backwards. I'd also like to make a discussion about the conditional use part of this. It's listed twice in NR3 for assembly. You can build buildings of assembly. I don't think that's appropriate for NR1 at all in this day and time. You know that there are churches in some of the neighborhoods that have a tremendous population.
I think that's a good point.
And we don't need to allow any type of assemblage in the NR1 neighborhood at all.
Is assemblage, what is that, like a sanctuary?
It's where you get, well, there's places of assembly is what he's referring to, which is a
meeting house, this right here, if you have this in a neighborhood.
So this is an assembly?
This would be an assembly.
Okay. I'm going to move a little quickly here because time is getting on and there's so much more to talk about. There are some significant changes to the regulations for townhouses. They no longer are required to have garages and no longer required to have a certain amount of recreation area. Let me read just the thing here that's been added to this NR3 change. Commercial uses will be permitted but limited in order to maintain the current balance and aesthetic in the surrounding area. I don't know how.
So if you're close to one of the crappy strip malls, you can build another one.
As far as the parking goes, I think in townhouses, the parking is limited. There's no requirement for parking on any townhouse property.
Can you say that again?
Well, we'll look that up later. All right, now let's go to.
Does anybody know what the purpose of that was for?
Eliminating garages.
And to allow them to have undescribed, limited business? I mean, what is the purpose of that? Can anybody explain why that was even included?
NR3, you mean?
No, I mean, they just said if now you can build condominiums without a garage or parking and less public space and have it conditionally commercial. Okay, what is the purpose of that shift, that change? Can anyone explain? Okay, please, tell me what's the goal behind that so we can get an idea.
I think it's been misdescribed a little bit. So when it says limited commercial use, it would not allow a strip mall in NR3. What it would allow is if you had like what they have in Brookhaven, where you have townhouses on top of like maybe laundry or a coffee shop, something like that would be limited, and they're strictly defined in NR3 what is and isn't allowed. So you can't just build like a giant strip mall in the middle of the housing neighborhood. You could build townhouses with maybe like a small coffee shop or a small laundry shop that the neighbors could use. So there are limits on that. There's not just unlimited commercial.
But, you know, just like Brookhaven, and that's a really good example, they did not have a strategic plan. Go to Duluth and go to Norcross, where they have had more of a strategic plan. because the only people that benefit from that, in my opinion, if they did that next to my house, they tore down the apartment complex, the apartment, and they built that, my property values would skyrocket without my property being worth anymore, unless somebody wanted to rip it down and build one of those. We have seen all over DeKalb County and all over many other counties where what starts to happen is we have single-family homes of what, 2,000 to 3,000 square feet. Somebody's going to come in and they're going to build what? That would be a 5,000 to 6,000 square foot building. That's also commercial. And if they built it next to your, where do you live?
I live on Market Street.
Okay, so they build that next to your house. And now all of a sudden, you've got a house that's next to you that is now valued at 4 to 5 times what your house is.
That means I can make a windfall if I sold my house and be rich.
No, it doesn't. What about those of us who didn't want to move?
If you don't want to move, you have access to a laundry shop, you can walk.
Okay, let me put it to you this way. That is your idea of a benefit, but it's not everybody's. Some of us have had to work our asses off just to pay for the houses and maintain them here in this city. How old are you?
Let's not start that.
35, okay.
Right now.
No, I am. I've lived here since you were 15. Okay, so I don't really appreciate you saying, if you don't like it, you can move.
But I didn't say that.
Yes, you did. You said you could make a windfall. I do not think, okay, this is the deal. We have empty space across from Thrift Town. We have an empty lot right there at North Indian Creek. That's the perfect place for a business like that. That's perfect. It's a large lot. I could definitely see development like that there.
And there are other changes that permit that.
No, I'm not saying that. I'm saying it needs to be limited. Why don't they tear down some of the shitty stuff and put that there? But you would need a developer who is willing to invest in that. And they're not going to do that when you have these kind of changes.
Well, if you, okay, do you want me to respond to that? Or
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay.
All right.
So if you want to have more retail development in the town, you have to have customers surrounding that town that can afford the nicer retail. So right now, what people want, what most developers are building, are houses on smaller yards with smaller setbacks, because most people don't want to maintain huge yards.
Yeah.
And so you know that's a modern development that's happening all over Atlanta.
Yeah.
So if we don't permit that,
We're not Atlanta.
but if we don't permit that in Clarkston, you're not going to see the retail development in Clarkston that you want to see.
Let me say, once again, I've lived here for 20 years, and I have lived here through a lot of development and not. And I can tell you, we had the LCI brand. I have worked with other cities doing planning, because I do that kind of layout stuff. And every single one of them that's successful had a comprehensive plan. No, this is not a plan.
This is fulfilling the 2040 plan that Clarkston agreed to
I
several years
have
ago.
to object to
No,
that.
this is not a plan, this is a zoning change. A plan is, we are going to court and find developers to build this kind of unit over there. And I can tell you right now, there's a reason they're not buying that property and building them there. It's not because people don't have any money to spend it. It's because everything around it does not support that. Okay? Once again, and I'll ask you, when you drive your friends in to see where you live and to show them Clarkston, are they more impressed with our downtown or our neighborhoods and parks?
Well, I think it's some of both. Part of the pitch.
Okay, and I did not agree to live in a small house where you're now saying we want someone that lives not in Clarkston, not even necessarily in Georgia, to come basically make a lot of money while destroying the unity and value of my home. Not really appreciated. Does anyone else here?
I disagree with that characterization, but I'll be quiet so we can continue.
Okay, let's continue. I think at some point we do need to get back to the issue of whether this supports the 2040 plan. I have one position on that. The city council member does also have a different position on that. But we're not talking about that today. We're just trying to understand these proposed changes. All right. I spoke before about the city of Clarkston having a number of areas already that allow residential and commercial. We have 4 of them, and they are pink, red, brown, and purple. So pink, red, brown, and purple.
So that's more than 50% of the entire place.
So that those areas accommodate today residential and generally lower level commercial that supports neighborhoods and that sort of thing. And several of them are tiered. And so you have neighborhood commercial 1 that is designed to be lower impact on a neighborhood. It would be a transition zone for this area, for instance, so that you could have exactly what is proposed. You could have a combination of residential and commercial, but it would not impact the neighborhood very much. So,
And I gotta ask Jamie, so looking at the map, where clearly at least over 1/3 of our property is already zoned for that, why isn't that the priority?
okay, so let's leave that question out there. So here are the changes,
Proposed changes, right?
the proposed changes. The pink, neighborhood commercial 1, the transitional, that's being eliminated. The N2 commercial, the red, that's being eliminated. The brown, neighborhood residential community development, that's being eliminated. They are all being combined into one district called residential commercial.
Horrible idea.
One district, residential commercial, again, one size fits all. So the idea of transitioning from one, now Jamie, you're shaking your head, have I said something wrong?
Go ahead.
So this idea of having them tiered is not in place anymore.
So we're not doing the Euclidean, the thing she talked about. We're going to a different kind of tier.
Hey, baby, how you doing?
I think what we're going to is an effort to simplify the zoning ordinance by, you speak up if I'm not getting this right, simplify the zoning ordinance. So you have single family here, mixed commercial, and then commercial and industrial. Zoning is not that simple. The devil is in the details. One size doesn't fit all. You can't take, in my opinion, a sweeping change to a whole neighborhood without an assessment of what is in that neighborhood, where these changes might be appropriate and where they wouldn't be appropriate.
We have one councilman in this room who's in favor of this. Is there anyone else in this room who's fully in support of his proposal?
Let's not start this until we finish. I have, now those changes are on page 36.
Proposed changes.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. And I urge you all, if you want to read anything other than what your property is zoned, this is the one to read.
Oh, okay, take care. All right.
Okay, this is the one to read. The height in this now combined district is 75 feet. Feet, 75 feet, 75 feet, 75 feet. Let me just move on a little bit. Some of the uses are by right, some are conditional. One of the conditional ones is a gas station. That doesn't mean it would be approved in any of those properties. It means it could be. Who will be making that decision? Elected officials. So if somebody wants to put a gas station on a piece of property, they don't get to do it automatically, but they come through the process. I want a gas station there. Community says, I don't think so. And then off you are to the races with the typical process that you have to go through. In the end, there is no guarantee that a gas station won't be built there.
And that's 2 months.
I'm sorry?
And that's 2 months.
Right, and then they can come back 2 months later and say, I want this gas station.
I have a question about the size and the height. Is 75 feet is the height of a building?
Yes, the maximum building height is 75 feet in all of those areas. So it doesn't matter if it's across the street from residential.
Yeah. Does that mean I could build an apartment complex at height?
Let's see what it says.
That's about 3 stories. That's about 3
In
stories high.
that district,
It would be
you can have
commercial.
single family, multifamily, duplexes, triplexes, condominiums, and apartment buildings. You can have townhouses, banks, childcare, professional services. As I say, please read this. This is such such a sweeping change in the zoning ordinance that it will totally transform Clarkston from a neighborhood-centered city with commercial support, a commercial development that is thriving and neighborhood-focused, to one where 75-foot buildings
That could be apartment complexes.
could be anything.
That's the most profitable thing you can build. That is the most profitable business you can build.
As if we
So
don't have
what I'm
enough.
seeing
Thank
here in this ordinance
And then all the sun is blocked from your
Yes.
house.
the weakening of our traditional neighborhoods.
Gonna step right back into the same pile of manure we were in
So
20
we
years
are
ago.
eliminating single-family residential. It's going to be medium-density residential.
Why hasn't that been put in that huge tan area where there's all this space?
Well, that is one of the areas.
Yeah, but I'm saying, then why did they do the pink and the red and all of that? That's what I can tell you why, because that area back there is harder to get to and more expensive to develop.
And you got a lot of wetlands back there.
Yeah, and so that's why, and we know that, so we know that builders want to build for a profit.
We're almost finished. All right, changes in town center. Town center is blue right here, so this is Thrift Town. Those are doctor's offices, I think, the dollar store is over here.
How many
This is
dollars
market.
is it for?
Two. There's some regular stores. This
We
is
need another on my street.
right here. So that's our town center, and that should be the heart of our commercial, and it should reflect what our city wants to be.
Well, they've
And
taken
it
it.
needs help. We all know it needs help. Nobody is against helping it. I would hope that there could be a round table with economic development experts who are all over the place in Atlanta, to come to Clarkston and sit down at the table with elected officials and citizens and say, what do we need to do in our downtown? Why aren't developers coming here?
A
So
comprehensive
there are not
plan.
many change, there's really only one change that I could see in town center.
The whole side of Market Street's been
It's going
changed.
to allow fast food restaurants.
Oh, there's another negative.
Drive-throughs, which is currently.
Oh my God.
No,
Kinds of drive-throughs.
no.
Maybe one that Chick-fil-A. I think it's nasty.
Some have loved
Chick-fil-A.
Here is how some cities do it. They are Decatur, and we are not Decatur, but Decatur has that good downtown that's walkable, et cetera. They don't have that in the center of their town. There are plenty of areas along this and this.
Nobody's gonna put a fast food
Private
restaurant down
restaurants
there.
might be appropriate.
Yeah, they will.
That's my personal opinion. That is not a professional zoning thing. That's my
Right.
personal opinion.
Has anybody contacted these other cities like Norcross and Duluth and Brookhaven and actually asked them how they did this?
I think,
What we do.
Jamie, would you like to answer?
Yeah, we've done that many times. We've had all sorts of LCI plans, we've had 2040 plan, we've contacted other cities, we've gotten other experts, we've done a lot of that.
We've had the Duluth, the mayor
Okay.
of Duluth has been here like 12 times. I've heard her 100
So
times.
this is what other cities are succeeding with allowing the mixed use, with allowing the town halls, with allowing townhomes, with allowing smaller lot sizes. That's what's encouraged development, like Brookhaven.
But they do it in certain areas.
Why?
But have other cities done overlays like
Don't
this?
support it being done this way.
Not at all.
I've lived here 35 years.
Okay,
and
I'm
I've
sorry,
seen
I'm
a
getting
lot.
off track. All right, the
Because what
only
we
other
could look like
change
is
I
Memorial
saw
Drive.
that, is that parking in all areas is, in all residential districts, parking is one space.
Yeah, it's less than.
It's a minimum.
Yes, minimum of one space.
You gotta
But
be
there's no
joking.
parking on the streets,
So-
so.
If you've got a condominium and you got two people who work, which is typical,
Average household is 2 cars.
Oh my God.
That's the average
I
household.
don't know where the other people are gonna be.
But you can.
Where are they getting all the specs
They're gonna
from?
build them.
You can't
could
park
put more
where?
than one if you want to, you're not required to do more than one, that encourages a more walkable neighborhood.
No,
If
it-
you want a walkable neighborhood, you
Yes, you
can't
want a
mandate a ton of parking.
Professionals have 2 cars per household.
I hear you, Jamie, and I totally agree. If you have walkable neighborhoods, but you're not creating those.
So Beverly is going to take us from here.
Beverly.
Hey, okay, number one, give
Thank
Susan
you,
and Susan a
Susan.
hand. Okay, did you like this in terms of providing information to you?
Yes,
Okay.
yes,
Would you like to have more of these?
definitely.
Okay, so that is something that we
But
want.
don't invite the city council.
And there's a donation.
Because everyone makes up our community.
Yeah.
Our elected officials, us, and so they need to hear how you feel in a positive environment so that they can take what you're saying and be able to craft or update material so that it works in the best interest of our
Right.
community. So that's number one. You receive a, we want to, and that's why we have this, to be inviting and engaging, and to make sure, again, educate, advocate, and empower. That is what we want everyone in our community to feel good about. Whether you've been in Clarkston for 1 year or 30 years, it doesn't matter, because we all have the same goal of having a wonderful community where we can be engaging with our residents and make the best of Clarkston. Right?
And where we can walk to
Well, we can
things.
walk. And
Walk
so
to
one of the
things.
things that, just on a side note, as a part of this, we need to make sure with that plan that it includes green space. Because as you cut up neighborhoods and change the neighborhoods, you
Yep.
decrease the amount of green space available to people. So we need to make sure in terms of that flow, if that's what we want to do in terms of work, play, live neighborhood, we need to make sure that we have those pockets of green space available for families to be able to have. So
Yeah.
that needs to also be an important part of it. Yes?
So that is part of it. What it does is it offers developers a density bonus if they provide more green space. So So they can put more units in if they provide more green space for the neighborhood and for the community to enjoy.
And that's an awesome
That is part of the
thing.
plan.
Right.
Fast food ain't gonna put no green space.
That's
Right,
right.
but in fairness, what we also want to do is, you have a green sheet, and there's some action items on the green sheet.
Not down here.
And so we want to make sure you take
It
note in
wouldn't
terms
survive.
of next approval process,
Next to
the
Catman
next
do.
steps, and making sure that you attend the meetings, particularly the meetings where they're like work sessions, because that gives you an opportunity to have engaging conversation with your council members. If you wait until the public hearing, or you wait until the actual council meeting, you will not have
Too late.
that opportunity to have that two-way conversation with your council members. So we encourage you, every time you have the opportunity at a work session, leverage that opportunity to voice your concerns. Make sure that you email your council members, and then when you email your council members, make sure that you have thought-provoking questions, or you can push them in terms of asking, how are they doing this? Making sure that you have a question and you think about how, in terms of solution-oriented, you want to be in terms of how you want your community to be.
Not how,
We don't
why.
want to make it where we're always just saying, I don't like this, I don't like that. But what is it that you want? And how?
And maybe a list of what we don't have a bank. I mean, there's so many things Clarkston needs.
Yeah, we definitely need a financial institution.
How do you get it back? We've talked about getting it back.
Yeah, we did.
We had Citizens Bank at Clarkston where I got my first car loan.
The bank is not allowed in a lot of the neighborhood commercial zones right now. Just to change that. So if you want a bank, you gotta at least allow a bank to come. And that's part of the plan.
Change the terms of that district.
Yeah, that's not.
And then John had a question, John had a question.
I would just say that comment about having one car in the driveway,
Yeah.
that's great. That's assuming that somebody's gonna use public transportation. The way to encourage public transportation use is to have high-density housing near the public transportation.
Yes.
A whole bunch of little single-family homes spread out everywhere is not the answer.
Yeah, sure.
It's not an efficient way to house people to begin with.
Right.
Having higher density near public transportation is a little more future-minded.
And we have two bus routes, here and here.
But you know
So
something.
this is our transportation node right there.
But you know something
Exactly right.
serious happened, which is that Marta dumped the line that went from Clarkston to Tucker. Because I used to take it every single day and it took me 12 minutes. Now it takes an hour because you have to transfer to
Yep.
75 because they said Clarkston didn't support 120, so they took it down Ponce. And now there's no transportation between Clarkston and Tucker, none. So that's why 120 is not being as full as it used to be, and now they're considering cutting the number of times it goes through. Clarkston needs to act upon it constantly. It's huge.
To Debbie's point,
Yeah, it's huge.
these changes are going to have long-term impact.
That's for sure.
It's not something that's going to just happen over the next 3 or 4 years. These changes will have 30+ years in terms of what they will do to our community.
Proposed changes.
Proposed changes. So, but that is why it is important that we as a community work with our elected officials to understand that whatever we're presenting is the best thing for our community. And this is something that should not be rushed into without having enough information and making sure that we collectively work together. So I'm glad to see as many people out here today because, again, for our elected officials, they need to make sure that they understand and see the concerns that the communities have. And so, Warren.
All right.